Good morning. It's Wednesday, July 22nd. I'm Jason Stanton. My morning musing I've been musing a lot about John Lewis. I'm a big history buff and have always enjoyed reading biographies. And I was not as aware of John Lewis's biography as I wish I had been while he was alive, but upon his death this past weekend, I've read and heard a lot more about him. One of the most heroic figures I think we probably have had in our lifetimes, and I just thought I'd share a little bit about what I've learned in case you haven't heard a lot about who John Lewis was and what he was about. This is a man who was a part of the sit-ins in Nashville. I've seen accounts of sit-ins and TV shows and movies, where black young people would sit in at lunch counters trying to desegregate a place where people simply eat. And then as they do, they get ketchup poured on them and mustard and maybe even hit. It turns out he was actually, he was at a sit-in once where the owner closed the doors, locked them, and then tried to fumigate him and his friend to death. So it wasn't just ketchup. It was far worse than that, and far too often. And then he also, after sit-ins, he got into the freedom rides. Freedom rides were challenging the desegregation of buses throughout the South, and just some horrific anecdotes that I've heard about that as well. He was arrested 40 times. And my favorite image of all the John Lewis stuff I've read and heard about has been his mugshots, and how often in his mugshots he's smiling. A very knowing smile, like, you're playing my game. And that game was nonviolent. I'm going to say a word about that in a second, which is something I've really been musing about. Once he'd gotten known for the sit-ins and the freedom rides, he then was asked to speak. He already had a relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. He was asked to speak at the March on Washington. I find it really interesting, as one who writes often, that as a 23-year-old, he came to Washington with all this credibility, having gone through a lot already, and he came with a speech saying what he wanted to say in the way he wanted to say it. But his elders, Martin Luther King and others that were responsible for what was being said from the dais at the March on Washington, they suggested he needed to tone down the rhetoric at least just a bit. John Lewis's initial draft suggested that he and others would march through the South, much like Sherman marched through the South, burning as he went. It sounded far more violent than John Lewis intended for it to sound. He wanted to sound revolutionary because he was interested in revolution, just not violent. That initial draft was changed. He was wise enough, even as a 23-year-old, to recognize the better way to get across what the message that I have is to tone down the rhetoric a bit. So from an early age, he not only was courageous, but he was also wise, knowing when to pull back a bit. All of this was rooted in nonviolence, which came to a head at Selma. There's a movement right now that the Edmund Pettus Bridge would be renamed the John Lewis Bridge. That is where perhaps he had his most famous moment, where he led a march across that bridge, very intentionally wore an off-white coat, so that when he encountered violence and was made to bleed, which he did have, his cranium was broken that day, that would be made as visible as possible. And so he and a bunch of peaceful protesters walk across a bridge and get their heads bashed in. That was a moment that was a turning point for many in the civil rights struggle in the 60s. And the courage it takes to be nonviolent in the face of people who are choosing to beat you is so amazing to me and so very Christian. Love your enemies is something Jesus challenges us to do. And I I don't know that we've seen it any more obviously than the way John Lewis and others that struggled for civil rights in the 60s did. One of the tactics that they would share with each other, this is so interesting to me, was when someone is attacking you, imagine the other as a baby. And remember that they were born as innocent and as without bias as you, and have been victimized as much as anyone to have to bear hatred. That hatred is a burden to bear, and here these people have so much of it. I'm not sure that as one was beating me, I could go there to think, oh, this person's a victim first and foremost, and that would keep me from hitting back. But maybe, for those of us who follow Christ, so many things are possible that we maybe didn't know were possible until we get to that place in time. So this day, I give thanks for the rain and for the legacy of John Lewis.